1865 to about 1874. And basically what we're going to talk about is messy business. You have the victorious North endeavoring to assure the supremacy of their major objectives in the conflict, the preservation of the Union, the abolition of slavery, and the establishment of government by and for all the people. But the restoration of the southern states was a constitutional problem that presented a host of difficulties. Slavery was ended, but what were we going to do with the newly freed men? Became a big matter of controversy. And as the war ended, civil government ended in Texas for a time, and anarchy prevailed. Like on the frontier, you still had Indian raids repeatedly threatening the lives and property of the settlers. And for a time, there was only the little rinky-dink federal troops in Galveston trying to hold all this together. Now, the first steps of Reconstruction basically began with Lincoln in December of 1863 when he issued his 10% plan. Basically, it was when 10%, the number of those who had voted in 1860, took an oath of allegiance to the United States and accepted all official acts regarding slavery, they could establish their own state government. And in conformity with this plan, basically, he restored statehood to Tennessee, Louisiana, and Arkansas. And from his second inaugural address, with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in. It looked like pretty much this was going to continue. Because remember, America had pretty much exhausted itself during the Civil War. Well, what would have happened if Lincoln had kept on? We don't know. Why? Because he was assassinated. Oh, but this is the reality of the new governments that were let in underneath Lincoln, like denied voting rights to black males, like Louisiana, only if you were an eighth or less, an octoroon or less, could you vote if you had served with the military of black soldiers, and maintained a lot of restrictions. And basically, President Lincoln urged patience. He said, look, this is as the egg is to the fowl. We're sooner going to have the chicken by hatching it than by smashing the egg. Because America was going to go through some revolutionary times. Now, like I said, what would have happened if Lincoln had kept on? Would Reconstruction have been easier? We will never have any idea, because Lincoln was assassinated. The guy who took over was Andrew Johnson. A little bit about his background. Johnson was from Tennessee. He was a Southerner. He was a Democrat that ran with Lincoln on the last presidential election. And one of the reasons why you have this two-party deal is because basically Lincoln wanted to show it as a sign of unity to the United States, that, hey, we're going to be getting back together. This big war is almost over. He grew up incredibly poor, kind of got into politics, never looked back. He was the only Southern senator that remained loyal to the Union. And so when Tennessee became reinstalled as a state, first he was put in as the military governor, and then he stayed there as the federal governor. And of course, he's a big-time believer in states' rights, and he thought the real enemy behind the Civil War were the planters, the really wealthy guys who had basically made slavery survive. His version of amnesty was much more lenient than Lincoln's. Basically, for the middle class, the states no longer needed to meet the 10% plan. Now all they had to do is call constitutional conventions. Because according to Andrew Johnson, look, the states never stopped being states just because they weren't in the right relational approach. Kind of like in a family, if you get into a fight with your brother, he's still going to be your brother, even if he completely ignores you. So basically all the states had to do to get back into the Union was to call constitutional conventions and write a new constitution. Now these new governments that arose, however, appointed former Confederates to governmental positions, which of course outraged the radical Republicans. Now, who are the radical Republicans? The radical Republicans are a group of Republicans that thought the South should be punished severely because of what they did to America and the cost that America had to pay. And by the way, they weren't the majority of Republicans. That's why they're called radicals. It's like you could say in the modern day that Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Cortez, they don't reflect everybody within the Democratic Party. They're the outliers. Just as you couldn't say Trump represented everybody within the Republican Party. Ready for the next one? So what was Johnson's expectations? Well, he believed that the Southern governments would abolish slavery, ratify the 13th Amendment, which of course made slavery illegal, hold elections and rejoin the Union. And you'd get a new class of political and economic leaders. You get all these guys from the middle class rising up, taking the positions of the former one-percenters. But what are the realities of these new state governments that enter? Well, they rejected black suffrage. They elected planters and former Confederate officials to positions of state power. And they felt justified in doing so. Why? Because the states felt that Johnson was their protector. And they believed that states, not Congress, would define the status of the former slaves. Meanwhile, in Texas, on June 19th, 1865, General Gordon Granger arrives at Galveston with 1,800 troops, and in the name of the President of the United States, he issued a proclamation. In that proclamation was announced that all slaves are now free. That secession from the Union is illegal. And that officers and men of the Confederacy would be paroled. And this is why on June 19th, here in Texas, we celebrate Juneteenth. Because that's the day the news arrived that slaves were freed men. Anyway. Now, free people. Basically, this news of emancipation affected roughly 30% of our population. Even though that's kind of a fluid number, but that's generally agreed upon by most historians to be accurate. And of course, Granger's announcement took time, and in some instances quite a time, to spread out and actually reach everybody. Like some slave masters immediately read the announcement of freedom to their slaves. Other slaves found out from the former slaves of neighboring plantations. And still others learned about their emancipation only when officials forced the owners to obey the decree. But by the end of the year, a majority of the former slaves of Texas were aware of their freedom. And of course, as I said, most of the slaves reacted with jubilee and celebration about the possibilities and freedom that was open before them. But soon, however, freedmen turned to the necessity of earning a living, usually by working for wages, sometimes by working for only a portion of a crop, where they'd have to share their crop with the landowner. And studies suggest that about 1/2 of them worked for their former masters for a year or more. So it was an interesting time. Now, one organization that was of incredible and tremendous help in the transition from slavery to freedom was the Freedmen's Bureau. This was a federal agency that offered some protection for the freedmen who sought to make their new freedom a reality. It was created pursuant to an act of Congress on March 3rd, 1865. Basically, it has the authority to take control of all affairs relating to the freed slaves, refugees, and abandoned lands in the conquered states. And in September of that year, the Bureau was set up under Texas, under E.M. Gregory, who was idealistic and enthusiastic. He set to work to protect freedom of the black population. And the Bureau did some relief work among the freedmen and provided night schools for several thousand. It supervised contracts and protected the freedmen from unscrupulous employers. But most of all, it labored to make the end of slavery truly mean freedom. Now, of course, they did have a lot of obstacles that they had to face. White Texans were generally uncooperative, and some were openly threatening, and some even violent. The program was never really adequately funding, and the Army was deeply involved in Bureau activities. For about 40% of the agents were soldiers, and a succession of military officers directed the Bureau in Texas, where the Army had to provide protection to the agents, but such protection was limited and sometimes non-existent. While some agents were committed, courageous, and energetic, others were not. And some, of course, suffered from a lack of integrity. And Bureau leadership changed frequently and left much to be desired in its effectiveness. But, notwithstanding these handicaps, the Bureau did have some successes. The most enduring and beneficial activity in the Bureau was the operation of a system of schools. And in January 1866, it had 16 schools attended by 1,041 students. By June of that year, the number of schools had increased to 100, with 4,447 students. And by 1870, there were 6,499 students enrolled. Oh, and by the way, a lot of these schools weren't just for kids. They'd be open during the day for the kids, then at night they'd have classes for their parents. Now, presidential Reconstruction. President Johnson's proclamation of June 17th began the presidential phase of Reconstruction in Texas for the purpose of reorganizing a permanent government, a process initially based on the military and provisional civilian government. By the end of the year, there were almost 50,000, not 500,000. There we go. Woo! 50,000 federal troops in Texas. Now that sounds like a huge number, but the majority of those troops was actually sent down to the border. Because in Mexico, Maximilian had established himself as emperor, and he was kind of supported by the French. So the U.S. government was anxious about that. But a few of them did go into the interior. by the way, George Custer actually was stationed in Austin, Texas for a little period. He was with a contingent of those troops. And the troops basically were not able to eliminate lawlessness. But we started to have the beginnings of a provisional civilian government when Governor Hamilton, Andrew Jackson Hamilton, arrived in Galveston on June 21st and proceeded slowly for Austin. On August 9th, he began establishing a new state government, appointing Union men to the office of like Attorney General and Secretary of State. And as rapidly as practicable, Union men were appointed to the district, county, and precinct offices throughout the state. And on January 8th, he called for an election for the Constitutional Convention. Because basically when the southern states left the United States, their old former state constitutions were null and void. And so elections were held. And on February 7th, under the President's plan, 4 conditions had to be met before he would accept the work of the convention. They had to abolish slavery. They had to define the status of the newly freed men, even though it didn't require that blacks were given the right to vote. They had to repudiate the oath of secession they had taken. And they had to repudiate the public debts that both the state and Confederates had incurred during the war. So what did the Constitutional Convention do at this lovely meeting? Well, rather than refute the Confederate oath, they recognized the supremacy of the U.S. Constitution. They also recognized that slavery no longer existed. However, they refused to approve the 13th Amendment. And the whole reason on why they refused to approve the 13th Amendment is because they said, well, it's already passed, so it's already law. We don't have to approve it. They did many things limiting the rights of the newly freed men, like blacks did not have equality before the law. Their right to testify in court cases was also limited. And black men were not given the right to vote. Which sadly was even present in some northern states. Now, why did these guys vote like this? Well, because they've gotten their butts kicked in a war, and they wanted stuff to change as little as possible. They don't agree to repay the state's debts. And then they go even further and validate and approve, because they were supposed to totally deny all the stuff that had happened under the Confederacy, because that was when we were in a period of rebellion. But these guys go ahead and validate and approve some of the laws that had been passed underneath the Confederacy that were not in contradiction with the U.S. Constitution. So what happens is basically Governor J.W. Throckmorton gets popularly elected as governor. On August 20th, President Johnson apparently approved our state constitution because he proclaimed that the insurrection in Texas was at an end. And then almost as soon as we get back into the Union, you start seeing the passage of black codes. Black codes were basically laws that were put into existence to limit the rights and freedoms of the newly freed men. Like they passed laws against apprenticeship, vagrancy, some labor contracts, all of which were calculated to keep at least some black people in a state of peonage. Throughout the South, states adopted such laws as these, known as black codes. And while the laws differed in particulars from state to state, some states were more repressive than others. The determination to place black people in a restricted and subordinate status was common to all. Basically, Throckmorton goes and he tries to make every effort that he can to restore the authority of elected officials, kind of bucking against the government. He sought to secure the removal of the military from the centers of population, put them out on the frontier, and put to an end the courts of the Freedmen's Bureau. And in this age filled with racial tension and resentment, provoked by war and military occupation, violence was to be expected. Indeed, between January and June 1867, the Freedmen's Bureau agents reported 30 to 40 crimes each month. Ordinarily instances of white attacks upon blacks. You had gangs of whites, like one gang, for example, in Hoffman County, raided black homes to collect any arms that might be found. You had outlaws like John Wesley Hardin, who added to their reputations as bad men by killing blacks. Another member of an outlaw gang shot to death a young black who refused to stand at attention when he rode by. Indeed, a committee of the Constitutional Convention of 1868 reported that 509 whites and 468 blacks had been murdered before the end of the year. Troubles sometimes developed where troops were stationed. For example, a Jefferson deputy town marshal deliberately shot 2 black soldiers to death. In another incident in Jefferson, a white man accused of murder escaped when a mob blocked a military detachment seeking to arrest him. You had federal officers that burned Brenham, and neither the soldiers nor the officers were ever brought to justice. White citizens distrusted military tribunals, and the military had little faith in civilian justice, only occasionally turning a soldier over to civil authorities for a trial. So basically you had anarchy and lawlessness in a lot of Texas, with both sides really refusing to see the other side. Well, it's because of this, and Texas isn't the only Confederate state where this is going on. It's going on in the other former Confederate states. And because you're having these riots that are breaking out, more and more people now are listening to the radical Republicans. In that, yes, the former Confederate states do have to be held more to account before they can be allowed back into the Union. And in the national election of 1866, the Republicans gained control of Congress. And guys, if you have 2/3 representation in Congress, what does that mean you can do? Like, Congress passes a law. What can the president do about that law? Anybody know?
You can veto it.
Yeah, you can veto it, which says, no, not on my watch. Well, then what can Congress do to that veto? If they have a 2/3 majority, they can override his veto. Now, the original founders put that in because usually a 2/3 majority is so difficult to get. But you have the president who says, I'm in charge of Reconstruction because I'm in charge of parole and all that stuff. And Congress says, no, we should be the ones who are in charge. So before they had congressional superiority, like 2/3, the president was able to get away with Reconstruction. But now Congress, led by the radical Republicans, because they have a 2/3 majority, they can pretty much override any presidential veto. And on March 2nd, 1867, they passed the first Reconstruction Act. Now, what did the first Reconstruction, let's see if I tell them. Yeah, here's basically what the first Reconstruction Act did. It said that all of the southern governments, these are the states that had been let back into the United States, well, now Congress comes in and kicks them back out again. It says that all of the southern governments were illegal. It basically broke the South down into 5 military districts. All the states had to write new state constitutions. They had to grant black male suffrage. And they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Now, what was the 14th Amendment? Well, basically, that was based on the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Did you get all that last line?
It's okay. I can go back in the notes. Yeah.
It was roughly based on the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that granted citizenship to the newly freed men. Johnson, of course, voted against it. Congress overrode his veto. It also contained the Due Process Clause. Basically, the Due Process Clause says that you cannot be deprived of your rights or property unless the government follows a process, a legal process of taking those away from you. And states were now subject to the Bill of Rights. Meanwhile, back here in Texas, on July 30th, Throckmorton, who was our governor and who was not going to leave, because he said the people elected me and Texas was a state that was admitted back into the Union. Well, the head general guy, the military district that Texas was in, along with Louisiana, Philip Sheridan, announced Throckmorton an impediment to Reconstruction, removed him, and appointed in his stead Elisha M. Pease. And then they go about removing a lot of other state officials that Throckmorton had put in. Now, was Pease a good selection? Well, yeah, he had served 4 years as governor before the war, and in many respects was much more flexible than Throckmorton and moderate in his views on most issues. And he generally enjoyed the confidence of the military authorities as well as the respect of the people he served, as they knew he looked out for their welfare. And they regarded him as fair and honest. And that is that.